Hello and welcome back to another video. In this one, I have found this map. It was released by a Clement Mullen, who is an 18-year-old co-director of the think tank Autumn Mundi, passionate about geopolitics, blah, blah, blah. The point is, he made this map and it is very detailed about all of the fortifications in Ukraine. This is all that he has confirmed so far. I noticed there are a few missing fortifications, but the vast majority of all of the fortifications are present on this map. This allows me to make this analysis possible, as well as more details to future analysis of the front line. So I recommend you check him out. Now, this video itself will be focused on what exactly is happening right now at the front line and the future plans of the Russians. Because right now we're seeing that the Russians have initiative throughout the front line, yet they've only committed a small portion of their offensive capabilities so far. They have significantly increased this over the past few days since the fall of Avdiivka, and with this we see that the Russians are likely going to increase their offensive operations in the coming weeks and months. This video will focus on where the Ukrainian fortifications are strongest, where they are weakest, and where the Russians are likely to strike at and towards. Now we look at the whole front line, we see that the vast majority of the fortifications in an area where the Russians are able to strike at a moment's notice, which means here from the Zaporizhia front and all throughout the north to the Kharkiv border. So with this we see that the Russians have a significant concentration of troops all throughout these three sections of the front line. These are three different areas which are considered three different army group areas. We have the northern front of the southeast of Ukraine, which is the Kreminna-Kupiansk direction. We have the eastern front, which is the Donbass, Donetsk region. And then we have the southern front, which is the Zaporizhia front. The concentration of Russian soldiers throughout this front line is about 200,000 in the southern front, about 250 in the eastern front, and 150,000 soldiers in the northern front. This all adds up to 600,000, which is the number that Putin put out there as to how many Russian soldiers there are on the front line. Now, looking at the fortifications, we see that the strongest is here in the eastern front, then comes the southern front, and then finally the northern front is the weakest. This is also reflected in the concentration of Russian soldiers, where 150k is in the north, the least amount, 200k in the south, which is the middle, and 250k in the east, which is the highest. We also see that throughout the front line, the fortifications, which are colored in orange here in the south and throughout the whole front line really, is the Surovikin line or the Russian-built fortifications, while the blue ones are the Ukrainian-built fortifications. We see, looking at the 2014 line, which is this one right here, that the Ukrainians had built fortifications all throughout the front line, which the Russians bypassed on the first few weeks of the war, capturing all of these fortifications and positions with their more large-scale offensive operations. They largely caught the Ukrainian army off guard, leaving them in a very distressed position where they couldn't really man these fortifications well enough to deal with the Russian advances at such a quick notice. But nowadays we see that the Ukrainians have manned all of their defenses, all of their fortifications, leaving no gaps for the Russians to exploit. As such, we see that right now the war is largely a stalemate, and that is largely due to the heavy fortifications on both sides of the front line. We saw that the majority of the fighting took place in the south and in the east, and right by the front line we see heavy fortifications on both sides. For example, the Battle of Avdiivka right here, there are heavy fortifications from Pisky through Opitne in the direction of Avdiivka itself, the south of the city, where the Russians broke through all of these fortifications by going through the pipeline, bypassing this whole section of fortifications by crossing through that pipeline. And with this, we see that the Russians got a major victory from that pipeline itself. But also in the northern part, we see that there are hardly any fortifications here, which is also why the Russians had a great success there. This map is a bit outdated when it comes to territorial control, but that is fine, as we will be focusing on the fortifications and not the territorial control. Now let's take a look at the differences between the Russian and Ukrainian fortifications. The main difference is that the Russian is pretty much a straight line. It goes all throughout the southern front from Vasilivka and to the east to Volovecha, here to the south of Volodar. And with this, that is one straight line, that is one long trench that is connected all throughout the front. While the Ukrainian positions are all spread out, they're all separate fortifications throughout the front line. And most of them are actually built in a circular manner. Not that they are circular, but the fact that either way the Russians decide to attack, they'll be facing off against some of these fortifications. The Russians attacking from the south, they'll be facing off against fortifications to the west, to the north, and to the east. All of these locations, the Ukrainians will be able to fight against it with these fortifications. Most of the fortifications throughout the whole area, as we can see, every single one of these are built in that manner, allowing the Ukrainians to pretty much attack no matter where the Russians are attacking from to defend appropriately against those fortifications. In the southern front, we see here that the majority of the fortifications are north of Orikhiv. By Orikhiv itself and to the south of that, there are Russian fortifications and pretty much almost no Ukrainian fortifications. This means that Orikhiv itself is separate from this defensive line. As for the north of it, we see that there are multiple layers of fortifications all the way up to Zaporizhia, but this is very limited in comparison to pretty much any spot in the Donetsk region. For example, if the Russians want to attack from Avdiivka towards Pokrovsk, going through the main highway, the Russians will have to break through the one that they've already broken through. Then they have to break through additional fortifications and villages before reaching another line of fortifications, yet another line of fortifications, and a third line of fortifications before fortifications that are circling around the whole city. As such, we see that the Russians have already broken through the first line of fortifications west of Donetsk, yet they have to break through additional 3 lines before fighting in a city that is heavily fortified. Comparing this to the northern parts in the Kharkiv region, we see that the Ukrainians pretty much have no fortifications north of these lines here to the north of Liman. The Kupiansk direction entirely is almost entirely without fortifications. There are trenches here and there, which some of them are even built by the Russians, like this one right here. And with this, we see that the Ukrainian fortifications in the north are very limited, while in the direction of Liman, there is this one line that goes through the northern parts, through to the Serebets River and down, and then there's multiple different entities of fortifications throughout, going around Liman itself. Finally, to the south of Liman, there are also lines of fortifications that are by Sloviansk. As for the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line, there is endless amounts of fortifications, both before them, ahead of them, after them, the direction of Jazov Yar. From Bakhmut to Konstantinivka, there are multiple layers of defense. There's one that goes through here by Ivanivske, which the Russians have captured the majority of these, but they are still missing a few. One by the canal line, one by Jazov Yar, or the Jazov Yar itself is acting as an outpost. To the west of Jazov Yar, ahead of Konstantinivka, as you can see yet again, multiple layers of defense before actually reaching the city itself that is also heavily fortified and located in heights. So we're seeing that the Ukrainian fortifications in the Donbass region are very significant. They are not to be underestimated. Comparatively, the Russian fortifications are also very significant all throughout the front line. Now, this raises the question, if the Russians are going to continue their offensive operations, where will they take place? We're currently seeing them fighting mainly here to the west of Avdiivka, where if we take a look, we can see that there aren't really a lot of Ukrainian fortifications in these first villages until the next line of defense, which goes here from the north, from New York through to the western parts, through Kalinova, Novokalinova, so on, connected all this way through, and this is just a major line with massive fortifications. But before that, this whole area here between Avdiivka and these fortifications is largely undefended. So the Russians will likely continue fighting through this area until they reach the defensive line. That will likely be their plan, to avoid the Ukrainians building new fortifications in these villages to slow down the Russian advances further. The Russians are likely looking to push westwards until they reach the next line of defense, which is here to the west of Sepove through Berdeshi in the northwestern parts and in the Pervomaisk direction in the northern parts. So this whole area right here will likely continue fighting over the next few months, as the Russians will look to gain control over these before the Ukrainians establish positions there. Moving down south to the Marinka direction, we see here in the direction of Friorivka, yet again there are areas with not that many fortifications. To the west of Pobeda, there are some fortifications here, and to the north of it as well, that the Russians are likely going to look to capture. And the reason for that is, if we take a look at Krasnohorivka, there are significant fortifications all throughout the eastern and northern parts. The southern part is largely untraversable due to the river line here. As such, the best Russian bet to actually fighting for Krasnohorivka would actually be to go around and attacking from behind. The Ukrainians have largely left this area undefended as they have fortifications to the south, and they have all of these natural barriers and so on, both from the north and to the south. But this means that the Russians, if they want to capture Krasnohorivka, they would either have to go through heavy fortifications to the east, which are multiple layers of trenches interconnected with each other and other fortifications, while if they go around, they can pretty much go through an open field. So that is the significance of the fighting by Hrohorivka. If the Russians continue and actually succeed in solidifying the positions here, especially with the capture of Pobeda, they have secured the southern flank, the Russians can continue in the westward direction and possibly go around and attack from behind. That could be a significant development in this section of the front line if the Russians are looking to capture Krasnohorivka, other than going through these fortifications and trenches here to the east of the city. Moving further south in direction of Novomikhailivka, we see here that there are a few fortifications within the village itself as well as to the south of it, but in the northern parts it's largely undefended as there's a large open field in between the Russian and Ukrainian positions. As such, with the fortifications by Pobeda as well, and them holding on to the city for a long time, they likely didn't expect the Russians to capture these positions and launch attacks from the north, but this means that the Russians will likely start attacking from the north of Novomikhailivka to pressure the Ukrainian positions. You also see here to the north of Konstantinivka there are several fortifications by the road itself, which indicates that the Russians will have a hard time attacking from the northern positions, and as such Konstantinivka is well defended from the north. This means that the Russians will likely continue pushing here from Novomikhailivka and from the southern parts, which is why so far we've seen the Russians focusing in this direction. We see that the majority of the fighting taking place by Novomikhailivka have been centered around the east and to the south of the town. As such, with these developments, we see that the Russians are likely going to continue in this section of the front line over the northern parts due to fortifications the Ukrainians have available here, but they'll likely continue westwards to capture Konstantinivka, which will allow them to capture the fortifications to the north of it and connect that with Pobeda. We'll see them launching operations here to the south, and yet again one of these circular fortifications by the Ukrainians, allowing them to attack or defend from every direction despite where Russians are attacking from, which means that the Russians will likely just focus at a head-on attack because there's no advantages to attacking from other directions. So the Russians will likely look to capture these fortifications east of Volhyne and north of Volodar, combining that with the capture of Novomikhailivka, Pereskovivka, and Konstantinivka, and then they can start attacking Volodar, because Volodar, unlike the other areas, do not have these circular fortifications. Their fortifications are mainly focused towards the south, and with the Russians capture or cut off the supply routes of the Ukrainians by Volodar, Volodar would be in an extremely vulnerable position compared to what it is in today. In the northern parts by Bohoyavlevka, as well as all of these villages to the north of that, we see that the Ukrainians have significant fortifications here. They have a very long line of fortifications from Marinka and through the western parts. This is to avoid a Russian assault from the south, from the direction of Volodar, Velika, Novosilka, in the northern direction towards Pokrovsk, or from the Marinka direction and then attacking Pokrovsk from the south. At the same time, we see that the fortifications by Avdiivka in that section prevents attacks from the east. The northeast, the Russians would have to go through the Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, Konstantinivka direction. Northwest, they would have to go around all of the fortifications in Zaporizhia, capturing the cities, so on. So that is very unlikely in and of itself. Yet the Russians are going to face off against massive Ukrainian fortifications in every direction, no matter what they do. A siege of Pokrovsk would be very difficult due to all of the fortifications all throughout the whole area. This means that taking a look throughout the whole front line, we see that there are pretty much no gaps in the Ukrainian defenses. The Russians will likely continue this very slow advancement on areas like Sinkivka, Petropavlivka, and the direction of Kupiansk. They will actually launch an operation to capture Kupiansk in the north, Oryhiev in the south, just to make some small advancements in areas that are less fortified than the rest, while trying to extend these battles for as long as possible in areas that are less defended or where the fortifications have been heavily bombarded by the Russians, to prevent the Ukrainians from gaining this significant advantage there is with fighting on the defensive. And with the Ukrainians fighting for every meter, they're pretty much playing into the Russian hands with this battle of attrition, where they're going to take more losses defending these areas that are less fortified or more bombarded than if they were to retreat to better fortified areas, because they have no shortage of better fortified areas, which makes it very confusing that they are refusing to withdraw to these better fortified areas. As such, based on this map, the only conclusion I can reach is that it is very unlikely that the Russians will launch any sort of large-scale operation in any of these areas from the whole front line. If they are to launch any large-scale operation, it will likely be from a new front, here from the Kharkiv direction, in the Sumy direction, or even in the Chernihiv direction. It is very unlikely for them to launch a large-scale operation either towards Zaporizhia, the Donetsk, west of Donetsk itself, or anywhere really throughout the front line, and it's more likely for them to continue this battle of attrition where they try to gain an advantage, however small, wherever they can. They are continuing their deep strike strategies while the Ukrainian fortifications are defense-in-depth tactics. As such, they are very much using a defensive maneuver and an offensive maneuver that matches with each other's idea or each other's tactics, where their fighting really is heavily dependent on the firepower. As such, the Ukrainians will likely just try to hold on for as long as possible, while the Russians will likely try to grind down the Ukrainians as much as possible. The objective of the Russians right now is simply to grind down the Ukrainian forces as much as possible to break the back of the Ukrainian army, to prevent them from continuing an organized defense due to the amount of losses that they will take throughout the fighting. This is why the Russians have an interest in keeping this fighting going, keeping the offensive operations going, despite not going for territorial advances, not because they don't want to, but because it's too costly, it's too difficult. They are instead going to be focusing around trying to grind down the Ukrainian forces as much as possible, bait them into these battles like the Battle of Bakhmut, the Battle of Avdiivka, which raises the question as to why Avdiivka fell so quickly. The Russians would have an interest in extending that battle for as long as possible, considering that they bypassed their fortifications, but could be some supply issues that would come with time if the fighting grew on into the spring season. But either way, we see that the fighting is now taking place all throughout the front line, and the Ukrainian fortifications are nothing to scoff at. And as such, the fighting will likely continue for a long time, as the Russians will try to break through these fortifications, and they will try to grind down the Ukrainian army to a point where they can no longer fight. However, if you are one of the people who want to see large territorial changes and the Russians launching a massive offensive, well, that may be in 2025, because major military exercises will be held in Belarus in 2025. It is reported that the Zapad 2025 will likely take place. It has so far been announced and it has not been cancelled. As such, it will likely take place. And the last time they held a similar exercise in Belarus, the rest have been cancelled from 2022 to today. In 2022, they took place from February 10th to 20th, after which 4 days later, the Russians launched its invasion of Ukraine. This is from an open source intelligence service that is critical of the Belarusian government, and they are keeping track of all troop movements within the territory of Belarus. So if the exercises are not cancelled in 2025, all troop movements on the territory of the Republic of Belarus will be carefully monitored to avoid a repetition of February 2022. So we see here that they're going to monitor it. So I'm going to be following their news throughout 2025 when that time reaches in a year. The Russians are likely looking to continue grinding down the Ukrainians all throughout 2024, continuing this battle of attrition until either the Ukrainian fortifications break, which will allow them to push through and break through their fortifications, or that the Ukrainian army ceases to function, after which they can launch new offensive operations all throughout the front line, capturing whatever territory they want in a peace treaty, as to have more negotiating power when the time comes to a peace being written. Because in the end, even if it's against the Ukrainian constitution, at some point the Ukrainians will have to sit at the table and negotiate with the Russians, whether it is on a basis of we both have fortifications all throughout the front line, let's just have a ceasefire, nothing's going to change from this current situation, or if it's going to be our army cannot fight anymore, you can just take whatever you want kind of sort of situation, which could happen in a year or two, or who knows how long this war will go on for, depending on the willingness of the Ukrainian population to fight and the amount of weaponry, ammunition, and so on that they have available. And that is going to be all for this update video analysis. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.